Everybody, we are backstage here at CrimeCon with Jon Ramsey, who is here with some of his family. We were just talking about it's your third CrimeCon.
Right.
Have there been any new developments in the case to find your...
Well, the biggest development, it's been probably a year ago, was they cleaned house in Boulder. Brought in a new police chief from the outside with good experience. He's a good guy. The Citizens Review Board recommended termination of 5 of their detectives for poor performance, including the one that had our case for years.
Christmas night should have been ordinary. Family, lights, the slow fade of a holiday. Instead, Jon Benét Ramsey's death turned a private home into a public puzzle that has stretched across decades. If you want careful updates and clear coverage as this story evolves, hit subscribe and turn on the bell now. We'll walk through developments as they happen and explain what they mean.
I have personal experience. So that was a big step. And I met with them, the chief of detectives, new guy, but experienced. And the chief of police I've met with, 3 or 4 times now. And I'm impressed. They're competent people with experience and good, logical, common sense.
And so have they started from, day one to go through the case?
No. I mean, what I'm advocating strongly is that they go to a outside lab like an Othram, whom I'm familiar with.
Jon Ramsey attended CrimeCon with his family for the 3rd time. Jon Ramsey's return to CrimeCon with family members is more than a photo op or a line on a calendar. It's part of a long, deliberate effort to shift the narrative and press for renewed attention to a case that has never closed. CrimeCon is a high-profile gathering of true crime journalists, podcasters, investigators, and families of victims, an event where cold case advocates meet scientists and law enforcement officials, and where public interest often translates into pressure for action. For Jon and his family, attending for a 3rd time signals 2 things simultaneously: persistence and public re-engagement. After years of being largely defensive, responding to accusations and trying to protect private grief from public spectacle, Jon has taken a proactive stance. He's not simply repeating a plea for justice. He's working the channels that bring forensic experts, investigative journalists, and resourceful advocates together in the same place. At CrimeCon, family members aren't just spectators. They meet with forensic scientists, attend panels about investigative genealogy and forensic advances, and use the platform to frame their case the way they want it presented. For the Ramseys, the conference offers the ability to press a point repeatedly and directly that modern science, particularly genealogical DNA techniques, should be applied to existing evidence. The optics matter too. In the court of public perception, presence equals seriousness. Jon's attendance with his family humanizes a story that media cycles had long reduced to caricature and accusation. It reminds observers that behind every headline are people who have grieved for decades and who still want factual answers rather than rumor-driven certainty. Crowds at CrimeCon are composed of engaged, often technically literate people who demand more than sensationalism. They expect responsible reporting and scientific rigor. That audience matters when a family asks for retesting or new resources. Public support at events like this can spur laboratories, foundations, and even law enforcement to take fresh steps, funding tests, greenlighting reanalysis, or at least reopening files for administrative review. In short, CrimeCon gives families a concentrated forum where advocacy and forensic possibility meet. Jon's presence with his family on this stage amplifies that intersection and underscores the practical aim behind his public appeals: to push institutions toward modern methodologies that could produce answers long after the original investigation stalled. Boulder Police underwent leadership changes, including hiring an experienced new chief. Local police leadership changes can be consequential, especially in a case like Jon Benét's, where institutional decisions made decades ago are still being examined for their impact. A police department is not an abstract bureaucracy, it's an organization shaped by culture, priorities, and leadership style. When a department brings in a new chief with a fresh mandate, it sends a message: priorities can shift, oversight can tighten, and previously stagnant efforts can be re-energized. Those are not just administrative outcomes. They alter how resources are allocated, how cold cases are triaged, and whether new technologies are embraced. For a family that has publicly criticized prior investigative choices, new leadership can provide both symbolic and substantive relief. A new chief with relevant experience, ideally someone who understands modern forensic approaches and the pitfalls that can occur in high-profile investigations, changes the internal conversation. Chief-level priorities cascade down to detectives and lab practices. When leadership publicly commits to transparency and scientific rigor, it creates institutional pressure to correct past mistakes and to consider previously sidelined leads. Reform can include audits of old files, reallocation of forensic budgets, and shifts in community engagement that rebuild trust. For the Ramsey case, this sort of change matters because it offers a reset, an opportunity to revisit evidence with fresh eyes, a new chain of command and clearer protocols for sharing findings with the public without creating sensationalized narratives. Public confidence in a police department is built slowly and, when damaged, is hard to restore. Leadership changes demonstrate a willingness to respond to criticism and a recognition that systemic issues, from evidence handling to interagency communication, require real, managerial attention. That matters in practical terms. Prosecutors and outside labs are likelier to cooperate when a department is perceived as competent and accountable, and funding bodies may be more willing to support retesting projects when they see a credible institutional partner. A new chief does not guarantee success, but it reopens possibilities that were closed under prior leadership. A Citizens Review Board recommended firing 5 detectives for poor performance. When a Citizens Review Board moves from oversight to recommendation of dismissal, it signals serious institutional concern. Such boards exist to provide independent review and community accountability. Their recommendations are not symbolic. They reflect formal findings about performance, procedure, and sometimes misconduct. In this context, a recommendation to fire multiple detectives for poor performance is an indictment of how investigations were conducted and supervised. It suggests systemic problems, failures in documentation, lapses in evidence handling, or poor investigative choices that have long-term consequences for case solvability and public trust. Accountability recommendations from a civilian body also change the legal and administrative landscape. Departmental reviews, disciplinary actions, and possible litigation are more likely when a civilian panel urges decisive steps. For families seeking answers, such recommendations validate complaints that prior investigative approaches were inadequate. For the public, they offer a measure of transparency. Issues are being acknowledged outside the insular environment of police internal affairs. Those findings can lead to procedural reforms, new training mandates, and the reassignment of cases to detectives with different skill sets, including those trained in cold case methodology and modern forensic partnerships. Making personnel changes in the wake of such recommendations can be contentious. Critics argue that firing detectives retroactively is a messy, politicized process that doesn't fix evidence that was mishandled decades ago. Still, the action of a review board often forces departments to confront uncomfortable truths, and confronting those truths is a prerequisite for long-term institutional repair. For a case like Jon Benét, the board's recommendation could mean that the people originally assigned, and whose decisions may have affected the chain of evidence, are scrutinized in a way that reframes how the department approaches reinvestigation. One dismissed detective mishandled the Ramsey case for years. Allegations that a specific detective mishandled evidence or led flawed investigative strategies are devastating in any homicide case, but they carry extra weight in a case as fraught as Jon Benét's. Mishandling can take many forms: failing to secure a scene, neglecting to document chain of custody, not preserving items that later turn out to be crucial, or allowing bias to shape which leads are pursued and which are ignored. When those mistakes occur in a high-profile case, their consequences compound. Evidence can be lost, contamination can be introduced, and investigative momentum can stall, sometimes permanently. Pinpointing responsibility for such errors does 2 things. First, it explains part of why the case did not progress as expected. Second, it allows for a formal reckoning that can enable future corrective steps. reassigning files, reconstructing timelines using remaining material, and applying new forensic protocols to preserved evidence. Dismissal or disciplinary action against a detective is not merely punitive. It's a recognition that process mattered and that breaches in professional standards have real-world costs for families and communities seeking justice. At the same time, it's important to understand that individual errors usually exist within broader systemic issues. A solitary detective may have been operating within a culture that tolerated shortcuts or lacked adequate training and resources. Addressing individual culpability must be paired with structural reform. That means improving training on scene preservation, implementing stricter evidence handling protocols, and ensuring that departments have access to modern forensic consultation when they need it. For the Ramsey family, acknowledging that mishandling occurred is a painful affirmation of what they feared, that mistakes, not mysteries alone, contributed to the enduring uncertainty. Jon has met several times with the new chief and detectives. Repeated meetings between Jon Ramsey and new department leadership are a sign of engagement that goes beyond rhetoric. Dialogue matters. When the family and department sit across the table repeatedly, the conversations move from public statements to operational detail. These meetings allow the family to describe lingering concerns, ask specific questions about what evidence remains, and request particular tests or methods. For the department, they offer a chance to explain procedural constraints, timelines for retesting, and the steps needed to ensure any new analysis is legally sound and scientifically rigorous. Such meetings also build relational capital. Trust is fragile after decades of public suspicion and procedural criticism. Regular, substantive meetings help rebuild that trust by demonstrating a commitment to responsiveness and a willingness to be accountable. They also enable a collaborative approach to problem solving. For example, agreeing on what items to prioritize for retesting, identifying outside laboratories with the relevant capabilities, or setting up independent oversight to ensure transparency. In effect, these meetings can move the case from adversarial posturing into a cooperative model focused on verifiable science. He finds the new leadership competent, logical, and experienced. When Jon Ramsey describes the new leadership as competent, logical, and experienced, that assessment carries practical importance. Families who have endured years of public doubt often develop a skeptical posture toward law enforcement. Positive endorsements from a grieving parent can change public perception and facilitate cooperation from third parties, labs, prosecutors, and oversight bodies, who prefer to work with credible institutional partners. Competence in this context means not only managerial skill but an appreciation for modern forensic workflows, an ability to communicate without inflaming public sentiment, and a preparedness to document all steps so findings are defensible in court. Experience matters particularly when handling legacy evidence. Detectives who have worked on cold cases understand the value of chain-of-custody audits, of using independent labs for confirmatory testing, and of coupling genetic leads with traditional investigative corroboration. Leadership that embodies these qualities lowers the risk of repeating past mistakes and increases the odds that any new findings will be taken seriously by both prosecutors and the public. Jon advocates using forensic genetic genealogy for the investigation. Forensic genetic genealogy has become the tool of choice in many high-profile cold cases, and Jon Ramsey's advocacy for its use is straightforward. It offers the best chance to translate a decades-old, limited DNA trace into a usable investigative lead. The method combines DNA profiling with traditional genealogical research to identify likely relatives of an unknown DNA contributor. From there, investigators build family trees and narrow possibilities using corroborating evidence. It is not instantaneous, and it is not a courtroom-ready piece of evidence on its own, but it has repeatedly provided promising leads that other methods did not. Jon's position is pragmatic. He doesn't treat genealogy as magical proof. He treats it as an engine that accelerates investigative possibilities. For a family that has lived with suspicion and stalled leads, the promise of an evidence-driven path forward is compelling. His advocacy also pressures institutions to prioritize resources for tests that require specialized labs and legal frameworks for database access and privacy compliance. This method requires new DNA samples compatible with modern analysis. One of the technical realities behind Jon's push is that modern genealogy typically relies on single nucleotide polymorphism (SNP) based profiles, which are richer in the kinds of markers needed to search public or commercial databases. Older DNA profiles, especially those generated in the mid-1990s, often consist of short tandem repeat (STR) profiles with far fewer markers. Those older profiles may be insufficient for genealogical matching. That means investigators often need fresh or re-extracted DNA that can be processed with next-generation sequencing or SNP arrays. Achieving that requires careful handling and sometimes additional sampling from preserved evidence, if such material exists and is uncontaminated. The current sample from 1997 only contains 15 markers and is limited. A profile with only 15 STR markers is limited by today's standards. It may provide exclusionary value, ruling out specific individuals, but it lacks the resolution for broad genealogical searching. Modern SNP-based approaches require hundreds of thousands of markers to build the kind of genetic map genealogists use to find relatives. Moreover, the condition of preserved evidence matters. Degradation, contamination, and earlier handling can reduce the quality and quantity of recoverable DNA. That's why Jon and other advocates argue for retesting using contemporary extraction techniques and sequencing platforms that can sometimes recover SNP data even from compromised samples. But success is not guaranteed, and legal and procedural safeguards must be in place before any reanalysis begins. Jon calls genetic genealogy a silver bullet proven to solve cold cases. Calling genetic genealogy a silver bullet captures the hope many families feel. Technology that has broken open other seemingly intractable cases could do the same here. High-profile wins, cases solved years after the fact using genealogy, give this phrase emotional and practical resonance. Yet responsible reporting must also note caveats. Genealogy yields leads, not convictions. Leads require corroboration through alibis, travel records, and physical evidence, and privacy and legal challenges can slow or complicate investigations. Still, the track record is powerful, and for families who have waited decades, that track record translates into urgent demand for access to these tools. Leadership changes in Boulder Police have injected cautious optimism into a long-stalled case. The findings of a civilian review board and the dismissal of detectives for poor performance underline how early errors damaged investigative capacity. Unknown DNA evidence remains the clearest physical lead that points away from household members, but that lead needs modern SNP-based analysis to reach its potential. Jon Ramsey's public advocacy, amplified by meetings with new leadership and by appearances at forums like CrimeCon, is focused and purposeful. He wants modern forensic genealogy applied with care and transparency. The path forward demands technical rigor, clear chain of custody, and public accountability, because only a disciplined approach can convert genetic promise into verifiable answers. This is the moment where science and institutional reform intersect. New leadership, community oversight, and a family pressing for transparency create a rare opportunity to reevaluate what remains of the case with the tools of today. Forensic genetic genealogy has changed the landscape of cold case investigations, but it is not a shortcut around careful detective work and legal safeguards. If departments move forward with rigor, documenting every step, engaging independent review, and pairing genetic leads with traditional corroboration, then there is a credible chance that what has been unresolved for decades may finally yield to truth. For the Ramsey family, and for a public that has watched this story for years, that possibility makes every careful, methodical step worth the effort.